Everyone, welcome to Tech Tuesday. My name is Tom Levine. I'm Cornerstone's tech guru here. We're going to go ahead and start talking about encryption and VPNs today. If you attended our last Tech Tuesday, we talked in general about data security. We had Jeff from Connective Computing come in as a special guest, and we're really thankful to him for covering a lot of that. He talked a little bit about encryption and how necessary it was to protect your business. And in order to understand what a VPN is, I feel like it's really going to be beneficial if you understand encryption more as a whole. So we're going to start with that and then get into exactly what a VPN is, what it'll do for you, and my different recommendations for which VPN you might want to use. But before we get into that, first, we're going to talk about a little bit of housekeeping. If you have a question at any point throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to type it into the questions box. I promise you I will get around to it. I'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation, and I will also be answering questions that I think are relevant to the topics I'm covering as they pop up. So don't hesitate to type in there, and I will get to your question. If I don't answer your question, however, during the presentation, don't worry, I haven't ignored it. I'll be sending you an email afterward with a detailed message. Also, if you have any questions that you don't feel comfortable asking in this presentation, please feel free to send me an email. My email address is tlevine@crnstone.com. We'll be covering that at the end of the presentation as well. Also, don't forget to check out our COVID-19 resource pages. Those are updated last I checked daily on our website. And that's, in my opinion, the best way to get up-to-date information about COVID. Not only do we vet different information from a lot of different websites, but we also make sure that stuff's up-to-date and accurate. Also, don't forget to check out our resource center. It's got a fresh new face with our document search feature, so if you're trying to get access to white papers and more, it's a good place to check. And last but not least, our autopilot program. With our autopilot program, you never have to say no to a client. It's a compensation-based client referral program that offers the services of our licensed representatives to quote, enroll, and support, and provide year-round service to clients that might just fall out of the scope of your business. It keeps them on your radar, and under this program, you can focus on growing your business with the products that you sell, and you can also provide anything that a client might want as well. So it's a nice way to keep yourselves open to different products. So that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about encryption. Encryption is just a general word for the field of encoding and sharing information securely. It can literally be any sort of code used to send a message. If you just invent some sort of cipher to share between you and your friends, that's considered encryption as well. The first methods of encryption actually were used by the Greeks to send messages between generals during war. And they used something called a skytale, or a cytale. I'm not 100% sure how it's pronounced. But essentially, these are specifically sized tubes. And if you wrap a piece of paper around a tube and then write your message in very large block letters, and then unwrap it from the tube, then this sort of warps the way the letters look, and it makes the message somewhat illegible. This was kind of weak encryption, but it was the first stab at it, so it wasn't bad from coming from nowhere, I guess. The weak point in this type of encryption, obviously, was that anyone with a similarly sized tube could then view your encrypted messages. But the next form was a lot more secure, and it was actually invented by Julius Caesar. It's called push letter substitution. Typically, this is combined with some sort of spacing as well. And I have a good example right there. This is using a two-letter push cipher. And it takes the word encryption, pushes all the letters up 2 slots in the alphabet, and then adds spaces after every 4 letters. And this is actually the exact same cipher that Julius Caesar would have used. So it takes the word encryption and makes it relatively unguessable what that word would be. Modern encryption takes this to pretty much an entirely different level, though. What modern encryption techniques use are very large substitution ciphers and spacing changes. Typically, these are governed by mathematical equations that are typically randomized. These equations use numerical inputs called keys as encoded instructions for exactly how to change the data that you're sending and receiving across a network. But that being said, there are multiple levels of encryption. This is, in my opinion, one of the harder parts to really grasp, I guess, if you're just coming into it fresh. So think of this kind of as different levels of communication. You've got your physical device, which is your hard drive on your computer, or your memory in whatever device you're using. Encryption at this level means that if someone were to, say, steal your phone or steal the hard drive in your computer, then they wouldn't be able to read the information on that drive because it's specifically encrypted. There are proprietary programs that do this to your hard drive. However, Windows, if you're using it, comes natively with encryption, and most other operating systems have some sort of encryption that you can enable as well. It adds security to a lot of your locally stored files. So if you're saving client information, you're going to probably want to encrypt your hard drive. It's useful, in my opinion, because it makes it kind of theft-proof. But one important thing to note about device-level encryption specifically is that it's very easily defeated by user error, and it does not actually encrypt the sender's files. So if you tell anyone your password, for example, then they can just get into your hard drive no matter what. They might need the specific software that you're using to encode the data on your hard drive, but they might not necessarily need to do that if they have some sort of cracking software. Then there's file level encryption. If you encrypt a specific file and send it, like if you're, for example, adding a password to a Word document or an Excel document to send it to someone over the internet, then that actual file, the data on that file, would then be encrypted. So if someone intercepted the message, they would have the actual text of your message. They would have, the user who sent the message, the receiver, and then they would have an encrypted attachment that they couldn't get into. Like the hard drive encryption, it's defeated by user error pretty easily. For instance, if you lock a file with a password and then send that password with the document over the internet, then whoever's intercepting your message has your password. Jeff touched on this in the last Tech Tuesday, but I think it's very, very important to repeat as well. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten messages from people with a encrypted Excel file with data on it, and then in the email it says password is 123, and that sort of defeats the entire purpose of locking your file down, and now it's no longer secure. So if you're going to encrypt files and then send them that way, please do not send the password in the same email, or just don't send the password at all. My recommendation is use a different form of communication in order to send passwords back and forth if you're sharing data that way. Something like giving someone a phone call, or maybe if you have a secure instant messenger, maybe send the password that way and then send the email separately with all of your encrypted attachments. Then there's the network encryption level, and this is what's most relevant to VPNs. So this is what I'm going to cover a little bit more specifically. It keeps information being sent over an online connection between two different computers separately encrypted, which means the information that's being sent from like my computer to your computer that goes out over the internet, that information is then encrypted. It normally has a sort of like a header information on it. So it has like, I'm sending it, you're receiving it, but then the actual data of the transmission is encrypted. And that's pretty much how secure networks work. Like I said before, with encryption, you need a key in order to encrypt and decrypt information. And believe it or not, the first idea of how this was implemented was with something called a symmetric key. And a symmetric key is essentially my computer and your computer using the same exact code to encrypt and decrypt messages. These symmetric keys originally were 56-digit keys or 56-bit keys, which means there are 56 different steps in the encryption process and different shifts in all of the binary code in order to encrypt your file. That being said, it's considered a little bit more insecure, not only because both users have the exact same key, so anyone listening in just needs to crack one key and they get your whole conversation, but also because a modern hacker probably has a lot of different resources or computers that he can devote or she can devote to cracking your code. Typically, a symmetric key at 56-bit length only has 7 times 10 to the 16th different combinations, which is 7 followed by 16 zeros, which honestly sounds like a lot. I doubt you or I would be able to just guess a code with that many digits accurately. But computers can brute force this and just guess a whole lot of different keys on a message until that message makes sense. Especially if you have maybe like 50 to 100 computers at your disposal, that might take 2 to 3 hours, which is kind of frightening. So symmetric key encryption is not really utilized anymore. The only times when it's really utilized is if you're transmitting data locally and just want to add a tiny little step in your security chain. But it's really not used anymore. Now keys, however, because of the 56-bit limit, use a minimum of 128 bits in these sort of symmetric keys, which actually increases the number of combinations by quite a lot. That's over 1 decillion different key combinations, or 1 times 10 to the 33, which is 1 with 33 zeros. I didn't type that out because that's a lot of zeros, and I didn't want to devote a slide to it. So that's something to keep in mind with current technology. The weak point of symmetric keys, however, was somewhat solved by public key encryption. And public key encryption, in my mind, is one of the coolest little quirks of math. What it does is it combines 2 different keys. So I have a personal private key, and then you, as a sender, would just pull a public symmetric key that's readily available. Typically, these are provided by some sort of proprietary service or by the encryption network as a whole. And then the sender, who has the public key, can send me their message. They use the public key to encrypt the message and then send it my way. I then can use a different key, which is called my private key, in order to decrypt your message. Not only does this mean we no longer have to communicate passcodes for encryption, but this also means that the key used in order to decrypt the message is not the same as the key used to encrypt the message. And that was honestly really confusing for me to grasp at first when I was trying to understand how public key encryption worked. I thought, well, how do you encrypt and decrypt information when our key codes are completely different? And this is one of my favorite little quirks of math, I guess. If you know anything about prime numbers are numbers that are only divisible by 1 in themselves. So if you are trying to do math with prime numbers, basically if you take a prime number and another prime number and you multiply those together, typically the only factors of those of that resulting, value, or the only inputs that can go into that value, are those 2 prime numbers. The way that public keys and private keys typically work is that one prime number is used as a public key, and these numbers are incredibly large. They're very, very long. Like I said, minimum right now of like 100 and I believe, what was it? 128 bits are used as a standard. A lot of times in encrypted networks, more are used, and these prime numbers are at least that long. When you multiply these 2 numbers together, you get a result. That result is then used as essentially the key to encrypt the message. Because there are only 2 factors of that number, when I receive your message and I have my private key, I can then decrypt it because I have the other part of the factor of that large number, and I can tell what number you use to encrypt the file. This is secure because prime numbers are really, really hard to find. That's why you'll hear occasionally stories of new prime numbers being discovered and it being a whole new revolution for encryption technology. Because not only does that add a whole level to encryption, but it's very, very difficult to guess that when two prime numbers are multiplied together to get a result, that those two prime numbers are what were used in order to get that key, essentially. In non-geek, it makes it very easy to encrypt data and nowhere near as easy to decrypt them. Not only are humans bad at doing this kind of process, but computers are really bad at it too. You might often hear as well that, quantum computers are going to really break encryption. And the reason for that is because modern computers kind of think like humans do in a way. We can only think of so many different options at once. With quantum computing, they kind of think of and store all the options at once. So with quantum computing, not only can they, basically guess a whole lot more options a whole lot quicker, but they can store literally all of the options in encryption, which is what makes it a little bit of a worry now that computers like this are starting to get developed. But that's a very long way off. And for now, public key encryption is probably one of the best ways you can send files. Typically, a hacker won't even try to break your encryption at this point because it's so difficult to break a public key encrypted message. They try to attack different parts of your system. And if you don't have an encrypted network or some sort of way that you keep your network offline, at least your confidential data, they'll try to break in with something called social engineering, which Jeff also brought up in our last presentation. If you're interested in a lot more of how to keep your own network secure, I would highly recommend watching that. It's available on our website. But hackers won't try to break your encryption, not only because it's really hard, but it's a lot easier to use social engineering. That's why it's so important you watch your email. If they do get into your network, they can install a little piece of nasty software called a keylogger. And what that does is it automatically monitors all of the keys that are used in your system for every transmission, even if you're using a state-of-the-art system that changes the private key that it uses all the time along with the public key that they're trying to use. If they're logging the keys that are being used, they can still decrypt your messages as easy as pie. It's basically like them getting your password. So that's why it's so important to try and keep yourselves secure online as well. The last thing you need to understand before we really get into the guts of how encryption works is going to be how the internet processes and sends information. We did cover how to set up your own internet earlier, and we covered generally the infrastructure used in what is the internet. But this only covered a lot of the surface information. And to understand encryption, you might need to understand one more level of it, which is how data is sent online. Essentially, your file that you're sending is broken into a lot of tiny bits of information called packets. These packets are about 1,500 characters long and get a sender and receiver address at the front and back. This way, when you send a message, you're sending a whole lot of these tiny little bits of information, essentially, across the internet. From, let's say, I'm sending you a file. It goes from me to my router to the internet at large. This could be going out to a satellite. It could be going out to my internet service provider. It could be going out to a whole lot of different computers all over the world in order to get to your final computer as your address. It could be going through something like a mail server as well. Because all of these bits of info are being sent pretty much all over the world, there's no real way to track how that information is traveling online, and that's natively insecure. What encrypting the data that's being sent does, essentially, is it jumbles the actual message. So when I'm sending a message to you, they see my sender information, they see your receiver information, and then they see a bunch of jumbled up information in the middle, which sort of functions as the actual the actual message, because we know how to encrypt and decrypt it. It's secure even though it's being sent over the internet as a whole. Essentially, there's one other step that adds a little bit more security to this, or that can, and it's called tunneling. What that does is it uses another device, essentially, to send and receive information. It means that I can encrypt my message to like a server, and that server can then be the one to access information. And that's how corporate VPNs work. Tunneling is kind of like a backdoor into a personal system or a private system. And that is what makes VPNs work. See, I told you we'd get to it. I know that's a lot of information up front, and it might have been a little bit hard to understand if you're not familiar with encryption, and I'm very sorry. But that's because I need to impress upon you the two different types of VPN that are available. There's site-to-site VPN, which is what you see advertised pretty much anywhere. If you're watching any sort of like YouTube video or you're seeing ads for things online and you're just browsing the web, that's normally what you're seeing. Often these will be things like ExpressVPN and options like that. With ExpressVPN, specifically, it's a site-to-site VPN. So it provides an encrypted network connection tunnel between you and the server owned by ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN's server then acts as a proxy for your device. So it can access all of the information online, and the internet at large doesn't see you as accessing those web pages. It sees that server as accessing those web pages. Remote access VPN works kind of in the same way. What it does is it provides that secure tunneled connection between you and a server located at your office, at work, or by a corporate VPN provider. Then that server can contact any other computer in its network, and that's how you do remote access. Typically, if you're using a system like this, you're going to want to own your own server, but there are services out there that will encrypt communication between multiple devices on, private lines and use their own server that you can lease in order to set up this kind of thing. And that's a corporate VPN network. A lot of times the services that provide private site-to-site VPN do not provide secure remote access. And that's something you really need to look at when you're trying to find VPNs as well. So let's look a little bit more at the benefits and the risks of what a corporate VPN will do for you and what a private VPN will do for you, because they're kind of the same thing. Like I said, they work in the same way, but the actual, service they provide is going to be a little bit different. A corporate VPN will give you access to a private network of assets pretty much wherever you want to go. Actually, believe it or not, if you have Microsoft or any other service, you can set up your own VPN. I would not recommend doing this if you're using it in a corporate setting, though. What the reason for that is it's very easy to set up incorrectly if you don't know what you're doing. You're going to want to find some sort of service to do it for you, or get your IT person to set it up for you. It also recommends port-to-port encryption, especially if you're using a corporate VPN. What that means is the connection between my computer and the server, and the connection between the other server at work or the other computer at work and the server is also encrypted. If you don't have port-to-port encryption and you're using a private service that's letting you use their router or their technology as well as kind of a stand-in for a server, you're going to want port-to-port encryption, because that means that the information that you're requesting from your corporate network isn't secure if you don't have port-to-port encryption. That being said, if you own your own and you're just, tunneling or VPNing into your private work server that already has its own firewalls and is already secure, you might not necessarily need port-to-port encryption, because once you're in your own network, it's local and you won't face any other attacks. One thing to note, though, it will always be slower than your typical local access of your local files. If you run a very small operation, I wouldn't even bother setting up a VPN. I would just take your encrypted information with you in a hard drive and plug it into your computer. It's a less source of failure, and it's a lot less complicated. The main use for a corporate VPN is for if you have a lot of different work sites, or if you have a few different employees that you want accessing this proprietary info. So if it's just a one-stop shop and it's just you alone, you might not necessarily need a corporate VPN. Private VPNs, however, you're going to want to look into a few different things than you'd want to check into for a corporate VPN. And this is just because of what they do and what the benefit of your private VPN would be. A private VPN will allow you to use your VPN's server as a proxy, kind of like what I explained before. It means that you send your request securely to the VPN server. The VPN server is then the one that's requesting that information. It's tunneled. So the address of you and the VPN is sort of encrypted and locked inside of the actual new addresses being displayed by the packets, showing the VPN and whatever information you're accessing online. What this does is it keeps your local device from being tracked directly, which means that you can basically pretend to be the server instead of your own computer. This makes it very easy for you to get around region restricted content online. Let's say I want to watch a show that's not available in America. If I'm using a private VPN option and the server that I'm using with the VPN is located in, let's say, South Korea, then I can access any information that's locked to the United States, but not locked to South Korea. It also is very helpful in avoiding content throttling from your internet service provider. If you're familiar at all with what's been going on with the current administration's talk of I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the actual service here, but essentially what happened is the FCC, that's it. The Federal Communications Commission basically made it possible for your internet service provider, which is Spectrum or AT&T and people like that, to prioritize traffic, which means that not only can they say, oh, well, this person's been watching Netflix for 3 hours, let's lower their speeds and provide more bandwidth to our corporate clients, but it also means that they can basically say, oh, this person's on our lowest tier of connection, we're going to give them our lowest tier service, and they don't have to provide the speed that you've requested at all points in the day. That being said, you're a lot less likely to experience this if you're using a VPN. And the reason for this is because all your ISP will see is that you are requesting information from a VPN's network. They won't see what that information is, and they won't see how that information is really being transmitted because it's all secured and tunneled and encrypted. Because of this, it makes it a lot harder for them to say, oh, well, they're accessing content that might be like Netflix or other bandwidth intensive resources. So I'm not going to throttle that connection. I'm going to throttle the person who is openly watching Netflix, for example. So that's just something to consider if you're shopping for a private VPN. That being said, it's also unnecessary. A lot of the selling points of private VPNs are that if you're online and you're, let's say, at Starbucks and you're trying to access your secured information from, let's say, Fifth Third or any sort of banking infrastructure, you want to keep your password and username safe, right? You also want to make sure that people aren't spying in on how much you have in your account or what your account information is. That's why a lot of modern protocols for sites use HTTPS. Just an example there is our Cornerstone website. It has an HTTPS in the very front, and that's actually the website's certification or certificate. What that means is that when you access our website, the information going between your personal computer and our website is already encrypted. So the network at large, the network that you're connecting to at Starbucks, might say, okay, this person is connecting to some sort of server at Fifth Third, but it won't know what that information is. And adding a VPN as a step in between doesn't really say, oh, you're not connected to that network. What it says is, I can't see what content you're accessing. So maybe someone on the network might be able to figure out that you're accessing Fifth Third, but they wouldn't be able to get any of your other information. which makes it not necessarily useless, but it makes it somewhat unnecessary for your security, in my opinion. Jeff actually and I got talking about this when we finished his presentation, and he echoed my thoughts. Well, I'm actually echoing his thoughts on this. But essentially, it's not necessarily something you need. But if you're very concerned about, content monitoring, it might be something you could be interested in. Using a VPN is actually really easy, aside from the actual setup. So if you're using a corporate and private VPN, the process is going to be about the same. Typically, if you're using a corporate VPN, you're going to get a piece of equipment that already has the network information and all of this sort of stuff that you need installed by your IT department if you have an IT department. If not, and you're using a corporate VPN, they'll typically walk you through the setup process, or they're going to send you some sort of software that you can just hit go on. And that will set up all of the connection, and it will give you a client or a little kind of software shortcut that you just double click on, enter your information, your username and password, and then you're connected to the network. Private VPNs work in much the similar way, but typically they'll download the client from their website. So you just set up your account, download the service, double click on it, create your account, and log in. It's really very easy to use, which is one of the reasons why it's so popular for security. So what do you want to look for? When you're using a corporate VPN, you're going to want to look for one that has end-to-end encryption. That's sort of one of the overall things that you're going to want to look for if you're using a corporate VPN option on a different server. You're also going to want to check to see if they have any sort of setup assistance or, good recommendations on the backend service. If something goes wrong, you might also want to see if the provider you're using will automatically disconnect you if it sees that, oh, my encryption's been broken. You're also definitely going to want to shop around. Unlike private VPNs, a lot of corporate VPNs don't necessarily have directly listed costs. And that's because there are a lot of different options that you can use in order to set one up. So my recommendation is you're going to want to shop around and compare prices. I do have some recommendations here in 2 slides, but that's just my personal recommendations from things I found. There are a lot of different options for corporate VPNs, and if you're using one that isn't necessarily listed, that won't mean it's a bad one. That just means that it's not necessarily one that I know about. So because of how prolific these providers are, it's going to be not necessarily the easiest thing to find one that we all use, but it's either way probably going to provide you with a good enough connection. So long as it has port-to-port encryption, if you're using their servers, you're probably going to be fine. Private VPNs, you're going to want to look for a little bit different things. You're going to want to make sure they have a lot of different servers all over the world. This makes it a lot more versatile for getting around content blocking. You're also going to want to make sure they use at least AES 526 encryption. And AES is sort of the new encryption method, but the number after any encryption method that you're looking at will typically stand for the number of bits used in their keys. 526 is even more secure than the standard that I referenced above, and I don't even want to get into how many different key combinations that is. It's just immense. So there's a lot of information and a lot of different keys that could be used, which makes their network incredibly difficult to crack. You're also going to want to check their statements for content monitoring. This is something that you might also want to look into for corporate VPNs, but typically they won't monitor your content anyway. What a private VPN can do, essentially, is because you're using their server to access information, they not only have your credentials for login and know exactly where your address and your computer is located, but they can also see exactly what you're accessing. So it blocks it from your ISP from looking at what you're doing. But the VPN themselves will know what you're doing. And typically you're going to want to look for some sort of privacy statement on their website. All of the recommendations that I have for private VPNs do not content track you. So they don't look at exactly what you're looking at. But Some of them do conduct security audits, and some of those might lead them to monitor specific accounts. So be careful, and like Jeff said in our last presentation, read the terms and conditions. The last thing you're going to look for is cost and deals. A lot of the options, say, oh, I'm more secure than my competitor. I do a bunch of these other different things, and they're not necessarily providing much more service to you. So you're going to want to look at the cost, you're going to want to look at the deals, and then you're going to want to check what they're actually doing in monitoring what you're doing and how they're storing your credentials. And I know that was a lot of information. So just 4 points of takeaway. If you didn't listen to anything else during the presentation, this is what you need to know. For work purposes, a VPN is necessary to access confidential data remotely. It encrypts your communications between you and your work network and makes it so you can access confidential data securely. VPNs on public networks don't necessarily add an extra step of security. What they do is add an intermediary, and then other people only see you talking to a VPN. So it's not necessarily necessary, but it doesn't add a lot of security outside of that. Also, VPNs essentially operate by letting you use a server. This means that the server acts as a proxy for your device. And sites will know who you are if you log in. Sites will be able to track you. Sites will be able to send you cookies and track what you're doing. It just blocks the communication between you and that site from being spied on. And lastly, it's not a foolproof security solution. The weakest link in any security is going to be the person who's using it. If you don't, practice safe online practice outside of using a VPN, you're not 100% secure. And security is only as good as the person using it. So just make sure you're following safe practices that we laid out in our last presentation. That being said, I do have 4 commercial options available. First off, NordVPN teams. NordVPN is at the top of my list because not only do they provide corporate VPN services, but they also provide private VPN services. So if you're already interested in getting a VPN for your corporation, they might give you a discount or some sort of bundling option on getting private VPN services for your personal devices as well. They don't actually have corporate prices posted either, and they will want you to talk to a service representative. The reason they're doing this is because they allow you to lease their own servers as well as just use their servers. So they kind of want to make sure they're directing you toward the best security solution available for you. VYPR VPN or Viper VPN is another one. Viper VPN is kind of near the top part of the list, in my opinion, because they specifically provide exclusively corporate VPN services, and they let you use their own servers to do it. They don't make you have your own local server to do anything. Similarly, Perimeter 81 is also one of the top options in my opinion. The reason Perimeter 81 is at the top of my list as well, as far as my 4 top ones, is because it also provides recommendations for people who must be HIPAA compliant. This means that, NordVPN or Viper VPN are probably going to be familiar with HIPAA compliancy, but Perimeter 81 absolutely follows HIPAA and will make sure that they are HIPAA compliant in what they're rolling out. The last one I'd recommend is AT&T VPN. And the reason I'm recommending them is because they're from an ISP. So if you use AT&T for your internet connection, they'll just tack on a small fee for the VPN. The one thing I will say about them, though, is for them, you do have to own your own server, and you do have to have your own local access stuff. The last I checked, AT&T does not provide leasing of servers, so they don't actually provide, completely encrypted pathways, and they're not a fully commercial option. They're useful if you have your own sort of infrastructure available to you, but they're not necessarily available for ultra small business that might not have those solutions. The last note I'll have on commercial options for you, Spectrum VPN. It does happen. Spectrum does provide VPN services, but it's IP only. It isn't fully private point to point, and they don't allow you to use their VPN to connect into your own personal server. They won't set that up. So they're not a very good corporate option. They're nice for private VPNs, but they're not really good for corporate VPNs. Also, as far as total cost goes, because a lot of these services you'll have to negotiate with some sort of sales department, a VPN shouldn't cost you any more than $70 to $100 a month. That's just if you're a very small business. Now, obviously, these costs can inflate depending on what you're doing. But if it's just, you and maybe 2 to 3 other employees accessing your content securely, it shouldn't cost any more than that. Absolutely shouldn't. Private VPN options. Now, these 3 that I've selected, I've already explained NordVPN and why I like it. But the difference between a lot of commercial options and private options are that private options are competing directly for a lot of different people's business. So they have publicly provided prices online. And there are a lot of different deals going on right now due to Corona. So you're going to get probably the best deal that you could ever get now on a VPN. I like ExpressVPN personally. It has a 30-day money-back guarantee if you don't like their product. It uses that same AES 526 encryption that I mentioned before. It doesn't log activity or traffic between what its users are accessing. The downsides, however, is that there's no kill switch for iOS, meaning if it detects that there's a data breach between your Apple device and its server, they're not going to disconnect you automatically. It has the kill switch available for any other sort of operating system, does not have it available for Apple. So if you're using an Apple device and you're trying to use like your iPhone to connect, they don't have that kill switch option. Prices can vary. If you're going month to month, it's going to be $12.95, which is actually one of the most expensive VPN options for private VPNs. You can also do a 6-month contract, which is about $120 per year or $60 per contract renewal. And then there is a 12-month option for them as well. The 12-month option is $832 a month or $100 a year. Next up is TunnelBear, and it's honestly my personal favorite, which is kind of weird for me. McAfee did acquire them in 2018, so when you're installing their client, I would highly recommend making sure you're not also installing McAfee in general. Pretty much any company that's acquired by McAfee asks you to install their firewall, and their firewall practices aren't the best. But TunnelBear is actually a really good service. It uses AES 526 encryption, just like the ExpressVPN option. And the real trick to them that I like is they run independent security audits at a minimum of once a year. What that means is they audit their security, they check for any sort of outside people accessing the network, and they're very transparent about when they're doing this. And they'll also tend to check to see if your credentials have been leaked for sale on the dark web. I think that's amazing, and that's one of the best things a VPN can do for you, because not only do they know if they're secure, then they check your credentials to make sure that other people aren't using your accounts with them. So that's why I like them. They're also less expensive than ExpressVPN. TunnelBear has 2 different sort of options on the plate. They use a 1-year option, which is $5.99 a month or $60 billed annually, and they have a 2-year option, which is $50 billed a year or for $417 a month, and it's billed in a one-time payment as well of $100 every 2 years. The one other thing I will mention, however, when you're looking at these VPNs, is a lot of them will say, "Oh, you have unlimited speed," and that is kind of hard to track because they're limited by your ISP's connection, for one. So you're only going to be as fast as your ISP is providing. But also, they parse out how much data you can use. For TunnelBear, for example, they'll give you a 500 megabyte free trial with an extra 1 gigabyte if you tweet at them during this trial. But then their unlimited bandwidth option, might cost a little more than their less, unlimited options. And the last one I'd recommend is NordVPN. We've already covered a little bit of what this means, but NordVPN specifically is their private option. NordVPN Teams is their remote access corporate option. So just make sure you have those 2 straight in your head. They not only have dedicated company servers that you can use, but even a private person can actually rent out a server and say, okay, I'm specifically going to say this server is mine, no one else can use it. And they'll allow that. They also don't log your activity. They utilize the same sort of encryption on open internet connections. They're used by Facebook, NVIDIA, Universal Studios, and Udemy, to name a few large companies that use them. And also, their pricing is very flexible. A lot of these options, ExpressVPN and NordVPN, I know specifically, will also accept cryptocurrency. So if you're into paying that way, then that's kind of useful as well. Actually, cryptocurrency came about because VPN networks can exist as well. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. That's for another presentation. But essentially, yeah, cryptocurrency functions with VPNs too. Month to month, the pricing on NordVPN for private use is $11.95. So they come in at a mid-tier option at $143 annually. If you're doing a yearly contract, that'll be $6.99 per month or $83.88 per year. And then a 2-year option of $4.99 a month or $199.76 billed biannually. And then a 3-year option, which is refundable 30 days for a free trial, sort of. And then it's also 70% off right now, which is $349 per month, minus $125.46 to give you $41.88 annually, essentially. It's also billed every 3 years. So one thing to keep in mind, however, is that these prices are subject to change. A lot of the wording on NordVPN's website said that because NordVPN is offering all these deals, it might revert to a different price at the end of those 3 years. So that might be something you might want to look out for. That being said, that kind of concludes our presentation on VPNs, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. I know we went through things a little bit quick there, and that's because there was so much content that we had to present and talk about. But if you have any questions, please feel free to type them now, and I'd be happy to go back and sort of summarize or recap for you. We do have a question first, which is, generally speaking, how much slower is your connection speed through a VPN? That's something that depends on a lot of different factors. Because a corporate VPN, especially, or even a private VPN, uses servers located all over the world, and your connection data is being routed through a lot of different ways, it's hard to tell exactly how much your speed will slow down. I will say a lot of times if you're using a VPN connection that is, personal, or a VPN connection that's available in your company, or in your nation, I apologize. It's not going to be very noticeable. If you're using a server that's located halfway across the world, that might be a bit more. To give you a general idea, the packets being transferred using a tunneled connection, using encryption, I guess, it generally, the encryption takes up about a quarter to a third of the data packets. So I want to say you're going to see about that much slowdown, but realistically, with how fast internet speeds are now, it's not going to be 1,000%, super slow. It's still going to be at least decently fast if you're using a really high ability connection, but it's not going to be noticeable if you're using, small amounts of data. It's really going to be noticeable, however, if you're trying to transfer large data files. So maybe just for emailing, it's not going to be noticeable. But if you're trying to download, full information, it definitely will be. It might add maybe an extra 13 to 20 minutes if you're downloading a large file. We do have another question from Christina, which is, what is the best service to use for email encryption? I'm actually not 100% familiar with a lot of different email encryption options, but I will say that Cornerstone uses something called Zix. And what you can do is, if you're communicating directly with Cornerstone using Zix, you can, send out that email, and then a person responding can use Zix to reply as well. I think Zix is a pretty wonderful service, and I'd highly recommend them if you're looking for email encryption options. We do have another question from Harriet saying that if you're using Perimeter 81, are they not available for a single user use? Honestly, I'm not sure. Perimeter 81 is aimed more for corporate VPN options. They're really more useful in setting up connections between, you and your work server, for example, or you and secure information. And that's really the main scope of their business. But they might have a single user product. I'm not 100% familiar with their single user side, but I know that Perimeter 81 is incredibly useful for the corporate connections. We do have another question. This one comes from Leslie, which is, can you connect a cell phone to the VPN as well? And yes, you absolutely can. You can use a lot of those private VPN options like ExpressVPN, NordVPN, and actually TunnelBear as well, do make that software available for cell phone use. The trick about using it with a cell phone is that, or a lot of these private options is that they're able to be used across a lot of different operating systems, which means that you can use them on your phone, on your work computer, and on your server at work, no matter what software they are running. I said before that you can set up your own VPNs, and I don't recommend it, but that's because the native ability of pretty much any operating system allows you to set up a VPN or a tunneled connection. That being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can set up a tunneled connection between devices not using the same operating system. A lot of these private VPNs and corporate VPNs are very useful because they allow your computer, which might be running on Apple or Windows operating systems, to connect to a server that is running on Linux or some other sort of operating system. So the VPNs, yes, can be installed and used for cell phones. A lot of the private VPNs actually, display that on their webpage and make it a feature. I don't know if there are any other questions incoming, but before we get any other ones, just to make a note, tomorrow we do have an upcoming webinar with Jeff Baglin involving Oscar. We have a special guest, Jared Wassley, and they will be covering generally selling during SEP. There will be a lot of good information there, so if you're interested in selling Oscar insurance, I'd highly recommend attending tomorrow. It's going to be at the same time as this presentation was. Also next week, June 9th, we have a very special joint session of Build Your Brand. I will be on that one as well with Jessica Larkin, and we will be covering how to build a corporate website. I'll be covering the general services that you can use and the background infrastructure of how it works, and Jess will be covering a lot more of the recommended pages you might have and things you might want to set up. That'll be next week on June 9th. And also the next Tech Tuesday on June 16th, we'll be covering a lot of cool new little pieces of tech that you're going to be seeing in the future. This can be anything like smartwatches, RFID, or any other sort of tech accessories that you might be interested in and why you might want to use them. So that's really wonderful in my opinion. We do have another question actually right now from Harriet. Saying, so for a single user, would you equate TunnelBear to Perimeter 81? It's kind of hard for me to say they're necessarily equal because they're providing completely different services, really. But honestly, I think TunnelBear is wonderful. Honestly, any of the VPNs I listed for private options are probably going to use about the same level of security as Perimeter 81. The real difference in what a private VPN does and what a public VPN does, or a corporate VPN does, I apologize, is that the corporate VPNs that are, for leasing use provide end-to-end encryption, meaning they encrypt the connection between your computer and their server, and then their server to the computer that you're accessing remotely. That's what Perimeter 81 does for the corporate option. With what TunnelBear does, they'll encrypt the connection between, your computer and the VPN, their server, but they won't encrypt the connection between their computer and the website. That's going to be relied on, the website using an HTTPS certification. So equating them, I'm not 100% sure that they're exactly the same sort of product. But as far as the overall security goes, yes, they're about the same. I believe Perimeter 81 uses the same level of encryption as TunnelBear. And it's no problem at all, Harriet. Thanks for asking any questions. And if you have any other questions that you're not okay with just sending out in the question box, that's fine as well. I'm going to display my sources here real quick because I did do a lot of research to make sure that I understood a lot about this VPN stuff. It's not necessarily complicated, but there's a lot of conflicting information out there. So it's very difficult to keep information straight if you're trying to research. It's part of why I did this presentation. If you have any questions for me directly, though, please feel free to call. My direct line is 513-487-5390. You could also reach out to me directly at tlevine@crnstone.com. And don't forget to connect with Cornerstone online. You can visit our website, www.crnstone.com, or you could follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I know that our media divisions take a lot of time and care to presenting what they present on those web platforms. So you're going to find a lot of good content there. And as always, a recording of this presentation will be available on our website. We're going to have that uploaded hopefully by Friday. So if you want to harken back to this webinar and maybe watch again about the encryption stuff, don't hesitate. It's always available on our resource center. I don't have any other questions, so I'm going to end the presentation here. But don't forget, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your work week. See you next week with Jess Larkin.